Jesus, if we think about it this way, missiologically set up the ecclesia. And so they're one and the same.
Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, Where God is at Work, a podcast that sits at the intersection of missions theory and practice. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauli, a missions leader serving in Rome. I'm here with Alessandro Di Leonardo, our church planter in Cisterna di Latina, and Jen Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. And today is our interview day, so we also will have later Jesse Cruz. So, how are you guys doing today?
Very good. Much better than the last few days where there was sick kids in the house.
Oh, man. Yeah, you passed it to my family.
Yeah, it hopped over a couple of kilometers and then went to yours.
How are things going, Jen?
Good. We have a sunny day here. We've had so many gray days that it just makes me very happy to see the sun.
You know, I was on a call with someone else from farther north in Europe, and they were making the same claims about how much they look forward to when the sun comes out. We're kind of spoiled down here in the south.
Yeah. Usually, Lyon, we have pretty sunny weather, even if it gets cold. But it has been one of the grayer winters. This is my 10th year in Lyon, and this has definitely been the grayest one we've had.
Oh,
Wow, congrats on going 10 years.
Yeah.
15 in France, but 10 in Lyon. Yeah.
We'll have to do a whole podcast on missionary attrition. That right there breaks some records, Jen. Hey, but before we go any farther, today we have a guest with us, Jesse Cruz. For those of you, this is an audio podcast, so you guys are going to be like, why does he keep hesitating when he says his last name? But Jesse's last name is spelled very different than how it's pronounced, at least for us English speakers. And so I'm working really hard to make sure I don't say something like Jesse Crazy or Jesse Kroze or any other Jesse name that could come out. But Jesse is the executive director of Touch the World, an organization that creates opportunities for youth to encounter God as they engage their faith through missions. And so we're looking forward to hearing from him. And as you know, we try and bring an expert on these interview podcasts. So no pressure, Jesse. But yeah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, fellow Jesse. I appreciate that. Yeah, the last name, I've gotten all the names, all the pronunciations in the book, so no pressure. Jen, Alessandro, great to be with you guys today.
Well, we're super glad to have you. And today, since we're talking about short-term missions, I just wanted to ask all of us, is there a funny story we might have about short-term missions, an experience we had either going or receiving? Yeah, anyone want to start us off with a funny story of short-term missions?
It's funny that funny stories are usually funny afterwards, not during. You just never know what to expect. You could plan everything, but then the unexpected always happen. And just this summer, we had a short-term mission, and they were here for 10 days. Maybe the second or third day, this girl just twisted her ankle. She didn't break it, thankfully, but she needed crutches. And so I had to ask myself, I've never got crutches here, so where do I get them? So I had to find that. But, crutches can only get you so far. And here in Italy, like, transportation is, not it's not always available. So in the middle of the night, missionaries tend to like to go out, eat the ice cream, all that stuff. And so how could she participate? And so we had a shopping cart, and I just jokingly said, hey, if you guys want, use the shopping cart. And guess what? They end up using the shopping cart and going in the city where I'm investing in. And they have videos of them going with the shopping cart to the ice cream shop, this and that. I was just like, yeah, I should not have made that comment.
Oh, that is funny, and I'm glad you made the preface to that about how we laugh later. Yeah, that's kind of perfect for my story as well, because we went on a missions trip. We were newlyweds. We had gotten married, I think maybe a month or two, and we went on a missions trip to Guatemala. And we had all the stuff told to us ahead of time about be careful with the water, make sure you don't swallow it, different things like that. We were way up in the mountains, made it through the whole trip, no problem, and then got back and for about a week was stuck at home with some kind of stomach bug. And first months of marriage, we got to know each other quite differently in that period of time where I was stuck at home not feeling so good.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. This is Jesse Cruz. I think one funny story. We had a group in Uganda. I'll share more of my story, I'm sure, but we lived in Uganda for 5 years, and so we had a group come and visit us in Uganda. And in Uganda, they have fresh peanut butter because a lot of the people are growing peanuts in their fields, and so our teams would often go out and help people even harvest those peanuts. They would call them G nuts, ground nuts. And so they would harvest them and then take them to the peanut butter mill to make the peanut butter. And if you know, like, real peanut butter, it's not the kind, like, it's not Jiffy out of the jar. Like, it's sticky, it's gooey, it's runny. I think you know where I'm going with this. So one of the kids on the team said, "Oh, I'd love to bring this home." I said, "Absolutely not. It won't pass through customs. Like, it's not good to travel with." So they got it all wrapped up. They took it without permission, put it in their suitcase. I think they took two, we're talking large, medium bins. Like, if you're to think of a Jiffy can of peanut butter, probably like the size of 5 of those together, like that size can. And it was two large bins of that. And so he put it in a suitcase, packed it up. We got to the airport, unloaded all the baggage, got ready to load it onto, into the terminal and whatnot to check in. And his bag was just seeping peanut butter all over the place. So we had to basically throw out everything that was in his suitcase. It was a disaster. And I was not happy. Alessandro, to your point, I was so mad in that moment that he disregarded what I told him, but it is hilarious thinking back on it.
Oh, those are great. Well, we look forward to hearing more of these kind of stories, hopefully throughout this interview, Jesse, because that one, you started us already off with a great story. But before we jump in, maybe it would be great to hear a little bit about who you are, your family, maybe it would be great to hear also your story, just kind of what led you to Uganda and then what led to you to now your position.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a long story, so I'm going to give you the short version. I grew up a pastor's kid in a Christian home, never was involved in missions, very traditionally heard about missionaries coming on Sunday mornings, and you kind of have the pin in the map and you know who the missionaries that the church supports are. But never was really interested until in high school. I was just reading a magazine. In the old days, we used to actually get magazines to the house and read them. And there was an ad for a mission trip in Mexico with an organization where all different youth from all over the country would fly down to Mexico. You would all meet up and then you would do this sports ministry. And so I was really interested in soccer. And so that was my first introduction into missions. And I remember very clearly standing on the top of a roof, I think it was our hotel, after a day of ministry and worshiping with that team in a way that I had never worshiped before. And really, I would say I look back on that moment and say that's when I really knew that God was my God, that I was saved, that I was a believer, that Jesus was real to me. In addition, on that trip, I took like Spanish 2 in high school, and we were playing soccer against teams in Mexico, and they obviously were beating us every time by a large margin. But it gave us a great opportunity to pair up with one of the other players from the team after the game and to witness and share our testimony. And I had, I was barely fluent in Spanish, but somehow I felt the Holy Spirit through me, giving me the ability to share the gospel in a way that I was like, wow, this is beyond me. I'm saying words that I don't even know how this is possible. And so those two instances really spurred me on my mission journey. After that, went on many mission trips throughout college, ended up serving or studying a semester down in Costa Rica, ended up moving down there after college just to learn more Spanish, and just kept exploring and leaning into what God was doing in my life. From there, I ended up connecting with Touch the World, which is a youth ministry, and Got connected to it by leading a coffee shop, running a coffee shop ministry that they had, and also being able to lead trips with young people and teams. And really, that's where my whole passion came alive. And I realized, wow, this is what God is doing in my life and what He's calling me to. And from there, met my wife at Touch the World. We got married. We prayed about where He wanted to send us long term, because we had always been a part of the short term side. We had been leaders, we had been goers, and we had seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of short terms, but in a very limited space, because you're only seeing it from one side. And so we said, wow, we really want to explore what God is doing on the global side as a missionary host, more in a long-term capacity. And so we stepped into a role in Uganda as missionaries, and started a community center and some other things that were already happening, and just had the privilege of walking with a very rural community in northern Uganda, which harvests peanuts and among many other things. And really were able to walk with them, develop a health center and some other just really amazing trainings for pastors, and walk with them in that journey. And that opened up our eyes to all the real deep issues with Westerners, and I think specifically Americans, coming over to the mission field. And that became the impetus to creating a whole new training for the organization. Eventually, they asked me to come back and be the executive director in 2013. And I've been in that role for, I guess, 11 years now, and really reformulating everything that our ministry is about. You know, we used to do just kind of what everybody knows as youth mission trips, puppets and skits. And like that was back in the 90s, early 2000s. And that's what we would do. You would do the gospel, you know, the 4 gospel laws and the gospel tracks. And that was our mission trip. And I think we started to rethink if that was really the best way, if we were really utilizing the ability to go and serve in the way that God was truly wanting to work among the nations. And so that helped us rethink quite a bit, which we'll talk about more in this interview. But that's a little encapsulated story.
That's so great. Thanks for telling us a bit about that and yourself. So last week, we talked about short-term missions from a theological perspective, and we focused a lot on some of the problems that come up with short-term missions. I wonder if we talked about like a savior complex or cultural arrogance, those sorts of things. Is there anything you would like to specifically address with regards to theology or bad theology, and how it can infect or disrupt what God can do through short-term missions?
There is so much bad theology in short-term missions. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I think so much of it stems from an individualistic, transactional Western culture. I think you touched on the savior complex and cultural arrogance, and absolutely wholeheartedly agree with those. Bad theology is the root of a lot of the problems we do have. And I think the issue here is that it's usually not explicitly wrong. It's not explicitly bad theology. It's half-truths. And I think that's the problem, right? You can find truth in almost every lie that we tell ourselves, or maybe it's not even a lie. It's a problematic practice that we're engaging in, and we don't even know it's problematic. And so what I would say is, number one, I think mission is often viewed as an activity. It's not viewed as a lifestyle. It's not viewed as something that people are engaging in year round, locally in their neighborhood, globally, in the communities around them that maybe they don't want to go to, that X18 model of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the ends of the earth. But we often view that as, I'm going to go and serve for one day. And I've checked the box, I'm going to do my missions activity, or I'm going to give the check, right? We see missions as an activity. And unfortunately, our churches have kind of taught us how to do that. With segmenting it as just one of many ministries. So I think missions as an activity is definitely one. Another one I would say is this idea that we don't need any kind of training. We have everything we need with Jesus and with the Bible, right? We wouldn't, what's absurd about this is we wouldn't believe this for our kids in sports. And, especially in the US, it's just everyone's consumed with sports. But we would never send our kid to a game and say, oh, it's okay, Johnny, if you don't go to any of the practices, just go to the game. You're going to excel. You're going to do amazing. It's absurd. None of us would say that. Right. But yet we believe we can just jump into the missions game and be a rock star and share Jesus, and that's all it takes. And it's just not true. We need some foundational training and some understanding. I think another false theology that becomes a half-truth is we believe because we have, and because we're generally rich and wealthy coming from America in comparison to the rest of the world, we need to help those poor people, which inevitably creates an us versus them mentality, this idea of doing for, not alongside. I'm just going to do something for you. And we believe that we're going to bring Jesus to people, and they need me to bring Jesus. I need to be right. You talked about that last week with this idea of the savior complex, and that's a very real thing. And then just this Western idea of it's my way, right? It's my experience is going to tell how we should do this. And when we were in Uganda, we just had so many Americans come over and say, well, there's a better way to do this, you know? And I said, well, I know in America, maybe in the US, but here it's not a better way, actually. And so subconsciously, I think we have approached missions with a my way is better mentality, with this idea of let me share my Western Jesus with you, and let's just get these projects done. The more efficient, the better. Right. And so we take on these kind of paternalistic patterns that end up just harming local communities. And in the end, unfortunately, it ends up hindering the gospel. Right. And the note here is like, it's all unintentional. That's the subtext. Like nobody knows they're doing this. And so this is where we need that training. We need that helpful guidance of people who have been there, people who have a larger context, like you folks that are serving long term, right? You're receiving short-term missions and you're doing ministry, all across the world.
Yeah, I just want to ask the question because it's interesting. You talked about how you went on many short-term trips and then moved over there to Uganda. So would you say most of this was learned from being on that receiving end and experiencing receiving people, or did any of this start to change or be sparked by even just your experiences ahead of time of going over there? I'd be curious to know that.
Yeah, that's such a good question, Jesse. It's, 100% it was a shining light that I saw after the fact. You don't know what you don't know until you know it, right? And you can't know it unless you're truly partnering with a community and truly hearing from folks that you have deep trust with. You can't develop that type of deep trust within a 1-week trip. And so I didn't know any of it. And so having my eyes wide open, and again, I call my 5 years in Uganda as like a wilderness experience of complete failure over and over. And that's how God taught us, is by failing over and over. But we also saw the amount of harm that was done, right, in the name of short-term missions. Right. And because of that, it impacted how we started to reframe our thinking.
Yeah, and that's what I hear you saying. There's training that's come out of a reframing that you've done based on your experience, and I love that. We used an article last week as a springboard, and it was funny because it wasn't so much that I disagreed with this author's criticisms of short-term missions, but I disagreed with his framing because he was criticizing short-term missions based on 3 outcomes. And those outcomes were participants' lives will be changed, people will be called to long-term missions, or I don't even remember the third one right now. Or, people will make valuable contributions to those who are in poverty. And I do think that often those are the stated goals for people doing short-term missions, but I don't know that I think they're the right goals. And so what you're talking about is this reframing. So I wonder, what would you say to that? How would you reframe?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Jen. I think from my experience, there needs to be a complete reframing, right? Number one, we call it a mission trip. Nobody's ever going to change that language, but we could give better language to it, like a discovery trip. And even at my organization, like, we know we can't change the language. It's set in stone. It's hard to change. But even referring to it as a discovery trip, we are going to discover what God is doing all over the world. We're not going to save anyone. We're not even going, at least in our context, to try and convert people to become long-term missionaries. If God wants to do that, that's fantastic, and we give that up to him. But it's not necessarily the goal. So your question is the right one, and the wrestle and struggle of what are the right objectives for short-term missions. All the studies, like you referenced, that I've read continue to say over and over that short-term missions is not worth it because of those stated objectives that they're measuring in their studies, which are usually how many long-term missionaries are converted, how much is people's giving going up because they've been on a mission trip. And all the studies show that giving does not go up, and there are no more long-term missionaries being formed because of short-term missions. And yet you ask every long-term missionary what their impetus for getting involved was, and 90-something% are going to say short-term missions. Not everyone, but it's usually a contributing factor. And so some of these studies, I agree with you, are problematic in maybe the questions they're asking. And also, I think I always go back to, are all trips, are we evaluating trips as a whole, or are all trips, different in a way? Are there different inputs that we're putting into them and therefore getting different outputs, such as, are we training, right? That's probably the big one that we're going to talk a lot more about, but also such as, are there long-standing partnerships? Or are we just hopping from one site to the next? And are we evaluating and, proving out these studies based on, one-off short-term mission trips where there's no long-standing partnerships, there's no training, people are going thinking that they're saving the world and they're just bringing Jesus to people. So I think context matters. We can't just do these studies and take them as a whole of everything that's happening. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And so the question of, like, what are the outputs that we're looking for? I mean, at our organization, we're specifically geared towards youth. And so it is a bit different where you're not taking adults on mission trips. We are trying to formulate discipleship of youth to have a missions mentality, a part of their discipleship as they're growing up. And what we're seeing anecdotally, it's not, it's not like a longitudinal study that we've done that has all the facts, but anecdotally, we just see that students that are involved in mission trips when they're young gain a heart for Jesus and solidify their faith in ways that other young people who don't explore God's mission and don't get uncomfortable and aren't forced to share their faith, they're walking away from the church and they're walking away from Jesus because they haven't tested it. Can I prove all that out? I think I could, with time and resources and studies, but those aren't what you usually see in all the larger reports that are out there.
Yeah. So in a summary, what would you, and I heard what you said, that trips can be different and have maybe even different outcomes, but what's your highest goal when you have a team that you're taking? What would you say? We have been successful in this short-term mission if what?
Such a good question. I think it could be different for each team because it really depends on the partner that we're partnering with. But in general, I think we want to ask, are we working together to meet needs of the community? Okay. Are we encouraging the missionary host? Is the missionary host coming away from this week encouraged, or just they are exhausted? Yeah. Are we praying together? Are we breaking bread together? You think of the early Acts church and just how they were treating each other. Are we proclaiming Jesus's life, death, and resurrection together in ways that are culturally appropriate? Yeah. I think these are all things, I look back, and Barna did a study in 2021 that asked the question, what do in-field hosts most desire from a short-term team? And I'm going to throw that question to you guys before I tell you what the result was. What would you say? What do you think in-field hosts most desire from a short-term team? Because most of you are in in-field hosts, right?
Yeah.
What would you desire most from a short-term team? And then I'm going to tell you what Barna came out with and what I think we're trying to align our trips more with.
We talked about this a little in our previous podcast. It is really internal help. Like Jesse was saying, babysit my kids so I can go do ministry. Or I've had teams come, our French team of missionaries has a field retreat every year, and I've had missionaries come and do the cooking and cleaning for that retreat so that we can just be on retreat. So it's kind of more like, sounds so selfish, but serve us.
Yeah, I framed it, I think, in three ways of like, come with the idea of serving the missionaries that are hosting you, encourage the local believers that you'll be partnering alongside, and then maybe share your faith as you have opportunity.
Yeah, so good. I mean, you guys are spot on. So the top 4 answers that Barna came out with and that we're trying to align our trips with is the number 1 answer was building deeper relationships with people who support your work or ministry. So like you said, Jen, supporting the missionary hosts and, just encouraging them. The number 2 answer was worshiping and praying together. Again, that's an encouragement factor of just being the body of Christ together. Number 3 was serving together with people from other parts of the world. So doing the ministry that the local host is already involved in, where the team is just joining in. And the 4th answer was knowing people value and appreciate the work you're doing. Sometimes the most important thing we can do as a short-term team is to encourage the long-term, the long suffering, of the long-term missionary hosts. That we care about and we want to serve. And so, you said that, Jen, and I know you guys talked about that a lot more last week and gave more context to that, but I think that's essential for us to understand more of how we reframe our trips and kind of some of those foundational principles, that we're not just going with this, I'm going to go and build a building, or I'm going to go and save 10 people mentality, which again are all built on half-truths that become savioristic and become problematic in the field.
That's so great.
Jesse, I thought you were going to say that your number 1 objective working with youth is that they all come back in one piece, since you have to deal with the parents afterwards. I thought that's what you were going to say. I hear you when you say, so as a church planter, like some of the things that kind of were highlighted when you kind of said, one of the issues is that we see STMs as an activity. And then kind of answering Jan's question, you kind of talked about reframing language, like the discovery trip as opposed to mission trip. I'm just wondering, when, a church plant, you're trying to kind of establish ecclesiology and missiology, where does the whole STM thing fit in? Like, where does that, like, if you could talk about that?
Such a good question, Alessandro. I really appreciate that. I think one of the problems with this is in the West, we like to create very distinct buckets of thinking, and we like to put people in those buckets, whether that's politics, theology, you name it, we think kind of in these lanes. And so when we think about ecclesiology and missiology, we think typically in lanes, and we put them in separate buckets, ecclesiology being the study of the church and how we become the body of Christ, and missiology being the sentness, that idea that God is a sending God and he's created us and asked us to also be sent to proclaim his shalom, right? Ultimately represented in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But Jesus, if we think about it this way, missiologically set up the ecclesia. And so they're one and the same, right? We cannot separate these and give a dichotomy to these two concepts. They are one and the same. And we need to think a little bit more holistically about it, because you can't have sentness without the church being the one sent, and you can't have a church that's not sent. They're inextricable. It's impossible, and it's actually antithetical to either ecclesiology or missiology to pull them apart. Now, I would say it's helpful to pull them apart for specifically understanding the nuance in each lane, but then we have to put them right back together and understand them as holistic. So then we get to this question of, where do we see short-term missions as part of this exploration into God's mission and his church? And we ask the question, where is God at work? right? We need to keep asking that over and over. And Acts 1:8, which we referred to earlier in the podcast here, says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all of Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth," right? And so short-term missions becomes one avenue of many to see what God is doing all over the world so that we may proclaim as his ambassadors the good news, right? This is a theological mandate for all of us as believers. It's not optional to live on mission or not live on mission. It's not for those people who are called long-term to another country cross-culturally. Well, it is for those people, but the problem is it's not excluded. It's not exclusionary. It's not just one type of missionary. It's all forms, which Acts 1:8 gives us a great concept and paradigm for the local, the here, the near, and the far, right? So it's not just the far. We have to remember there's a practice of formation that when we go far, it's teaching us how we can also live here and near, right? And how do we live that out? That's the challenge, right? How do we go on a trip and explore what God's doing all across the world, which I believe is a great avenue for short-term missions, to see how God's at work, and then to bring that back home and say, well, I saw how God was at work in Uganda or in Greece or in China. How is God now at work in my own community? And not only that, how is God at work in the communities around me that I haven't wanted to go to, right? The Judeas and the Samarias. And so I think it's a discipleship idea that I just imagine, and we don't have a lot of explicit examples of this in the Bible, but I got to believe that as Paul was visiting church to church, and as he was talking to the Corinthians and the Romans and all of the churches, I can't imagine that he wasn't like, hey, do some of you believers want to travel along with me? Come with me to this next place I'm going to for as long as you can. I have my core disciples. They're going to be with me for good. Like, they've committed to this. But would you commit to coming and seeing what God is doing over there in Rome, over there in Corinthia, and figuring out how God is moving? I got to believe there were other people traveling along, seeing the miracles done. And then they said, you know what? I got a business I got to run. I got to go home. But the way I'm going to support this is I'm going to keep running my business so that I can send that money to you to keep this work going. We don't see those explicit stories much. I think there's a few, but we can take that paradigm, that understanding, and say, I think there's a place for exploring what God is doing across the world, seeing how he's at work, and then joining into it.
Yeah, and I love that link, Jesse. I think back to the creeds. I go to a church that recites the creed, but one of the things that you say at the end of the Apostles' Creed is that we believe in the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Apostolic is literally sent. We believe in the sent church. And I think you're right. We separate those things out rather than recognizing that they are inextricably linked to each other.
Yeah, and I if I could, I think of that story, Jesse, of Luke, right? Luke in Acts 16 kind of writes himself in the story, and most people believe that's when he joins the trip and he follows with Paul, and then eventually he kind of writes himself out, which people think that's when he leaves. So that could be the perfect story of Luke. Luke ends up not being the typical missionary, but he ends up writing the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. And so kind of a great, I loved what you were saying about that. I think that's a perfect way of framing it and picturing it and bringing it to the church to understand what all of that means.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because I think sometimes we lump or we might assume by short-term trip or missions trip we have one idea of what it is, but the reality is short-term mission trips can look different. They probably should look different depending on where they're going, and all of us, as you alluded to earlier, Jesse, are career long-term missionaries serving in the cities that we're in, and have had various experiences with short-term teams. Like Jen was saying, we've had teams come that, literally I know of one group of missionaries that they just bring in a team that does church or does a babysitting schedule, And so they literally just sign up the whole week that they're here, different families for times and slots to babysit their kids and give them a break. What have you seen? You know, you guys are your ministry is all around short-term mission trips, but then you also have life experience from outside of Touch the World. What have you seen are differentiating factors for a short-term mission trip?
Yeah, there's so many. I think what I want to talk about here, we've adopted as an organization 8 mission principles that have been the anchor points for how we think about, I mean, you could call it our missiology, right? As an organization, it's specific to short-term missions, like you mentioned, because that's just our world. And we do believe in the next generation. We believe God is raising up students, and we believe that Gen Z is a hopeful generation, and Gen Alpha, and all the generations to come. We just really believe in the next generation. So these 8 mission principles continue to guide us in everything we do, but they're also not specific to our organization. So all of us here can apply these mission principles even in long-term missions. So let me just run through them and maybe explain each one a little bit. The first one is missions is a lifestyle. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but missions is not an activity, and we have to reframe that in our mind and understand that mission, and to your question, Alessandro, with missiology and ecclesiology, missiology is a lifestyle, right? And mission is everything that we are as a disciple of Jesus. It's not for someone else, although it is for all of us, but we can't look at it as, well, that's for them and not for me. I'm not called to missions. That's not an option in the gospel. In our understanding of what it means to be a disciple, we have to be on mission. The essence of mission means that you have to be in movement. And so I don't believe that Jesus calls a disciple to keep their feet planted. If anybody wants to argue that point, maybe they can, but I guarantee you they're not going to find some biblical rooting in that, and they're not going to find a firm theology. And so we root ourselves in that idea that mission is a lifestyle first and foremost. So we learn by going on mission so that we can bring it back home, and we can be stretched to go to the places we don't want to go to, and even be called, if we're hearing the Spirit and if He's calling us to it, even going long term, right? So mission is a lifestyle. It's kind of this foundational idea really rooted out of the Missio Dei, that God has called all of us to mission. Then you have number 2, our number 2 principle is training is essential. So we believe fundamentally that you cannot engage in mission without training. There's just things you need to understand on a cultural level, even on a gospel level, understanding how the gospel is interpreted in other cultures. I'm sure all of you have read, or maybe you haven't, I'm not sure, even our listeners, the 3D Gospel. I found that incredibly helpful in just understanding that there's different cultures who approach missions in a different way, or approach the gospel sharing in a different way. For instance, as Westerners, we're going to share it very much based on the guilt that we experience. And so Christ's sacrifice covers our guilt, whereas another culture, let's say in Asia, is going to be more along the lines of understanding Jesus as the one who brought honor, right? And covered our shame, because we experience shame and our sin brings shame upon us. And so the gospel brings this renewal of honor. And then the third one in that is fear and power. And so there's cultures that think, oh, there's just spirits everywhere and we need to be afraid and we need to, do justice to the spirits. And Jesus comes and says, no, you don't need to worry about all that. I am the all-conquering power, the all-conquering spirit that trumps all of the other spirits. And so, yeah, there's this cultural understanding that we need to understand. We don't understand that if we don't train, right? We could list all the other things we train in, which we'll talk about more after this. The third one is partnership matters. So this principle that you cannot go on a short-term trip without a solid ongoing partner that you trust and that has the same theology, missiology, ecclesiology that you do, right? What are we doing when we're in this? We all know of the short-term mission factory sites. You might chuckle because somebody comes to mind, I'm sure. Somebody that they're running 52 trips a year. It's how they make money. Maybe they're doing great things with that money, but they're a short-term mission factory. And I'm not sure that that's the best practice when we're talking about short-term, that that's the best way to partner with global missions. And so we have to understand that partnership matters, who we're partnering with matters, the theology and missiology behind it matters. The fourth principle that we have is God is already there. And this is a reframing principle, because I think as Westerners, we think I'm going to bring Jesus to the poor people, or to, and define poor however you want, whether economically, spiritually, it could be in any of those elements. But this idea that God is already at work in all people. The issue is people might not recognize where he's at work. So we get the privilege of going and being a short-term team that can say, hey, do you see how God's blessing you with this land and all these peanuts that are being grown? And you're so rich, this fertile land. We don't even have land in the US. We live on quarter acres of land or eighth acres of land with our house, and that's about it. That's all you can fit. And so pointing out and saying, God's already here in the culture, but you may not have recognized how he's at work and where he is. So let's point him out so that people recognize, and let's ask for stories about how God's at work in this community. It's a reframing so that it takes this idea of like, I'm bringing Jesus to anyone out of the picture. And you're saying, no, God's already here. He's at work. The fifth principle is poverty is brokenness. So this is rooted in the gospel story of sin, right? You have creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Poverty in its essence is because of sin. It's because of the fall. And so if we reframe that, rather than poverty is just people that don't have money, then we begin to realize there's no difference between anyone who's economically poor and myself who might be socially poor, or, I might have mental issues that I'm dealing with. There's all kinds of issues that we can talk about. I might be spiritually deprived, right? And so poverty comes in all forms, but at its very core, poverty is brokenness. And if we recognize that, then we break down the us versus them mentality. The sixth principle is do with, not for. And we've talked about that, right? Not giving handouts, not just doing something for people and being the paternalistic savior coming in, doing a good deed, but you're doing things alongside. You're doing things with the community, with the local missionary hosts. You're fitting into what's already being done. One of our core principles as an organization is we will not work with any host that says, we want you guys to come in and do something brand new, unless it fits into a larger strategy. We're not going to come in and run a VBS if you're not going to keep that VBS going, and if it's not part of a larger discipleship framework within your church. A VBS doesn't make sense if it's contingent upon a team coming, right? And so do with, not for. The seventh principle is empathy across cultures. So understanding that all of us live in different cultures, different contexts, and that we need to step back and have a little bit of empathy to say, hey, I might not understand all the factors going into this, but I'm going to have empathy for what their practices are, how they relate with each other, the differences that might be there. Now, within this, we're not talking about the non-negotiables of Scripture, right? We're not talking about having empathy where maybe there's a direct biblical mandate. We're talking about cultural aspects, right, that differentiate between culture to culture. And the last one, the eighth one, is ask before assuming. So this idea that we do not know the answers as a short-term team. We need to ask and be humble enough to say, hey, I saw this happening in the community. What might be the reason for that? Can you explain that to me? Whether you're asking the missionary host or one of the local community members. Hey, I saw people in the community doing this. I'm assuming that it's because of this, but I might be wrong. Can you correct me or tell me where I might be off in this thinking? It gives that posture of humility to reframe and say, I'm a humble learner. I need to ask before I assume. So that's just a little bit of our framework and our 8 mission principles that guide our training and guide all of our trips and kind of guide how we filter out who we're going to partner with and how we take trips.
Those principles are amazing. And I know you can find them on your website. So we'll make sure and link your website in the show notes, because I think it's such a great missiology. And really comprehensive. So I imagine those guide then your training programs. So can you talk about then what does the training look like? How, how do you take youth who are coming in and don't have these experiences at all and help them live out those principles when they go?
Yeah, again, I go back to like training is essential. I think it's one of the pieces we miss the most. I heard a pastor recently say that they've had trouble, that our culture has trouble, especially the American culture, calling people to a higher commitment because people are just overcommitted, whether it be sports or just schedule. And so this idea that we need to call people to a higher calling and mission, it feels disconcerting at first because you're thinking, well, I'm already too busy. There's too much going on. Can we really call people to higher accountability? And the answer, that this pastor gave is you absolutely can. And it's amazing. You'll be shocked what people actually step into when there's a higher commitment. They actually rise up to that commitment. And what it does is it weeds out the people that aren't meant to even be there. And that's a good thing, right?
Exactly.
We need to get rid of. Yes.
Right. If they're not in the place where they're ready to do this, that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, your question to it, so what do we actually train in? So we do, and this is specific to our ministry with youth, we do a 3-day intensive mission training. And I believe that church meetings, I've typically heard of like an 8-week consecutive, we're going to meet after church. And those are fabulous, very necessary. Unfortunately, most of those trainings become, what do we need to pack and how do we pray? And I don't want to diminish prayer. Prayer is essential, and we always should start and end and, throughout the whole trip be praying. That's essential. But we can't just be having prayer and packing parties. It's not enough. We need to humble ourselves and be prayerful, but then we also need to do the work to learn the things we need to learn. And so we do a 3-day intensive that we find, we take away all the students' phones, and people tell us, oh, you can't do that in this culture. Well, we do, and students survive, and they actually come back from their trip and say, not having my phone for a week or 2 weeks was the best part of my trip. And I actually talked to people and got to know people and shared the gospel and got to know how God was at work. And you're just like, okay, it's calling people to a higher calling that we don't think is possible in this culture, but it is. And so have faith, all you fellow short-term mission trip people, that you can take away their phone, even long-term hosts. Just tell them we're going to be going out for a day of ministry. Leave your phones at home. You do not need them. We'll tell you the time. We'll tell you where you need to be. It's just not worth it. So on a very practical level, what we train in, we train in basically 3 topics of identity, culture, and mission. And this is not just for youth. This is for anybody. It's for adults. Identity is really, what's God's story? How do we understand God's story beyond just a 4 gospel laws or gospel box or some type of manipulative that we can use, but really embody and understand a good theology on creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, and how we're a part of that. And so that's identity. And then part of that is also, how do I share my own story, my own testimony of what God's done in my life? The way we teach that is have some kairos moments in your pocket. And by kairos, I mean, kairos is a Greek word for time, and, time, not just chronologically. So not just sharing your testimony, I was born here and then I did this and then I met Jesus, and then, which is our typical mission trip testimony, but share a God moment, share a God sighting. Where did God work powerfully in your life? And just share that moment and bring in those themes of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and talk about how Jesus met you in that pain, right? So that's a big piece of identity, which is kind of the first point of our training. The second point is culture. And so really helping people understand that cultures are different, that culture, all of us have heard culture explained like an iceberg. You see 10% above the surface, but 90% is below the surface, which is why we need to ask and not assume, because most things are just, we don't understand and we don't have context for. So we do a lot of cultural training on how do you understand culture in general. And what we tell long-term hosts is do the specific training when they get on site. It's your responsibility to do that. right? And then mission is that third area. And mission is really helping them understand how do they serve on a practical level. So again, how do we keep time, and how do we understand how to eat everything on our plate, and how do we understand how to be the embodiment of a servant, right? When we don't eat what our guests are giving us, we're upending God's mission and what he's doing, because we're showing that we're too good for your food. And so if we're too good for your food, well, then why would they receive what I have to give to them, which is eternal life, right? Jesus. And so there's some basic principles that we don't often connect, but are so deep and so necessary for us to understand. So identity, culture, and mission are kind of how we frame everything out. We also do just as a side note, we also do what we call a $2 day, which is a economic poverty simulation, where teams form families in a fictional community living on $2 a day or less. And we present them with problems like, let me just give you one so that you can picture what we do. Like, your youngest daughter was sent home from school today because her uniform was ripped. Do you pay to have that uniform repaired, or do you feed your family tonight? And they have to figure out, okay, wow, I never thought that people actually have to make these decisions of my child going to school and how important their education might be, and fixing their uniform and spending the 50 cents I have on fixing it, or I was planning to spend that 50 cents on rice and beans tonight to feed the family. So do we go without food for one night to be able to send our daughter back to school? Mm-hmm. We've never thought about those things as Americans, at least, or as, anyone in the mid to upper echelon of economics. And so it starts to reframe things. And we hear students come back from trips and say, you wouldn't believe it. We experienced, and somebody told us they were experiencing something that we experienced in $2 day. And we're like, that's great. That creates empathy, and it creates skills to listen and respond. And so, that's a little bit about our training and what we do. We send all of our teams with a resource guide and a field guide and a devotional guide that's specific towards missions, and a reentry journal to help just process the before, during, and after.
And is that training available only to those who are going through Touch the World, or is that a training, say I have a mission team from my church that wants to come? Do you have any resources available for people like that?
So we do. Yeah. It was about 6 years ago that we decided God is doing something amazing among all these youth, and he's given us a lot of tools over the years and life experience that we've been able to bring together, specifically in this area of short-term missions. So we were able to solidify that within our organization, develop all that curriculum. And then we said, why can't adults use this? Why can't someone in California, we're in New Jersey, so I just use California as like, why can't somebody in California use this material? And so we developed an online missions academy. So it's called The Missions Academy, themissionsacademy.com. And it has comprehensive short-term mission training, as comprehensive as I think you can do online. We still say in person is better. But online it sets a good foundation. And so if there's any long-term missionary hosts that are like, I have teams coming to me that aren't trained, you could tell them, hey, we require this. This is something that you need to go through before you come, to at least get a foundational starting point, and then you do the specific things when they come to you. So, yeah.
Wow. Jesse, you just blew my mind, because you told me if you guys are in New Jersey, and that's where I'm from.
Hey, great.
Yeah. No, but with what you said, that's really awesome from the sending side. I'm just wondering from the area of the receiving side, and I'll just throw 3 questions and you can answer them how you want, in what order. One is, what kind of training do we do for the people, for our people? Like in my case, I'm in Italy, for my church to receive people. 2 is, you mentioned specifics for the people coming. What kind of specifics are you talking about? And 3rd is, say we're not working with an associations like yours, we're just working with the local church. And how can I, the host, make sure that they are doing training over there? Like, what are some questions that you think we should be asking? Or like, you want to be like, hey, are you guys training your people? Are you guys doing a good job back there? Like, what are the questions that we should be asking, so to ensure that they're doing something over there?
Yeah, I think given all the stats that we're seeing about short-term missions and all the harm that is done, and we all recognize that there is harm that's done with short-term missions, we need to be unapologetic about demanding training. in whatever capacity. It doesn't have to be the Missions Academy. It can be your local church has a robust training, or your missions organization really does that well. But let's be honest, most don't. 90% are not doing any sort of training besides a packing and prayer party, and 8 meetings of just saying what to pack, and here's the immunizations you need, here's how we're going to get the visa. So we need training. We have to start there. I think, your question to long-term hosts is really good. I can only answer that from having been a long-term host for 5 years. So if what I say is helpful, I'm sure some of you have much longer experience than me and could give even more helpful answers. But I would say, what questions can you ask team members to ponder that they've never thought about? In other words, are you taking this team just to fill a week and do ministry? Maybe they're kind of helping, but they're really a burden, and that's how you view it. Or are you really viewing this as, how can I invest in these people who want to join in God's work with me and encourage me? And hopefully the team is coming with the right motives. We're assuming that they are, right, with this question. And so what can the long-term host do? They demand training. They ask good questions. So how can you help team members ponder things that you just take for granted? What are things that are unique in the culture that you're serving, or aspects in the government or country that you're serving that fellow believers are wrestling with and they're dealing with, that an American or anybody else from the outside, if they're not American, is coming in that they've never thought about? And it would spur them on to think deeper about what are those issues. Then I think how we need to be asking ourselves as long-term hosts, how can we create opportunities to stretch faith of our brothers and sisters from other countries that are coming in on short-term teams, right? If the team is American, how are we stretching their faith in the aspect of, a lot of Americans like to worship just hands at their side, and they don't clap, and they're very stoic, and that's okay. That's one way to worship God, right? Sing out of the hymnal, and that's very respectable. There's some great heritage there and great history, but a lot of our brothers and sisters across the world like to jump around, and they like to lay hands on people, and they like to be very expressive, and they wonder when why our teams are coming that are such followers of Jesus and so full of faith, why they're standing there like somebody just died, right? And so I think we can do a good job as long-term hosts teaching them, hey, this might be uncomfortable, and it might be culturally different for you, but I'm asking you to step into this. I'm asking you to stretch yourself. I'm asking you to, as awkward as it feels, clap your hands and move around a little bit, so that we show our fellow believers here that we are actually excited about Jesus, and we're excited to be here with them. I think as long-term hosts, we have the privilege of teaching, training, and guiding fellow believers to expand their vision of what's possible in the kingdom. To know how to pray deeper and more for the place that they're visiting and getting experience with. And so take that seriously. Don't brush that aside as an inconvenience. And again, I'm going to end with the same way I began. Demand training. Nobody does anything without training. So why are we allowing short-term teams to come and visit us without training? Could that mean that there's less money coming into the ministry? And that our core church partner that supports our personal support is going to be upset with us? Maybe. But is it worth it? And I think we really need to reckon with that, because this becomes an economical question for many long-term missionaries. Is it worth it if I stand on this? Basically, the question we're asking is, would I rather have my personal support, or would I rather have the gospel shared in a way that's relevant and that my community really appreciates, and that no harm is being done, right? And if we love our people and are serving our people, I think we have to elevate the people that we're serving and say, you know what, for the sake of the community that God has called me to and the people that I'm serving, I have to elevate this as a non-negotiable for the community back home and the church partnership that I have, and do my best to explain it in a way that's not going to be off-putting. But we do have to elevate our own community, because we are the ones serving there, and we have to make sure that we are cognizant that we are stewards of that community when we bring in a team, and we can do nothing to upset how the gospel is being spread. We have to make sure that the gospel continues to be spread in a relevant way. So we have to demand that training. All the other stuff, I think, comes within the training.
Wow, yeah. The emphasis on training and what you're talking about, Jesse, I have to throw this in there because I used to like and watch basketball quite a bit, but there's a famous Allen Iverson video that's gone viral for many years. He's like, "Are we talking about practice? Are we talking about practice?" And yes, we are in a sense. Training is preparation for the big game, preparation for the moment, and it's so important to make sure that we're prepared. And there's grace in that. We're still going to make mistakes. We're still going to have problems. That we're still going to mess up culturally when we go somewhere. But the better prepared, the more we can honor those. I said in the other episode before that it was really opened up to me when we had a short-term team here, and they thanked me for trusting them with the relationships that I had been investing in for years. And that really helped me see that, there is something to stewarding those relationships that we have. And, one of the things that we like to talk about Paul as kind of a missionary example. But in Philippians 2, we also have this picture of Jesus and the idea that Jesus coming down in crossing cultures, I guess, in a sense, and going from the divine to human. And that description in the hymn in Philippians 2, 5 through 11. How do you translate that idea of Jesus into a model for STMs?
Yeah, that's such a good question. We try and use Philippians 2 as kind of the basis for understanding how we engage in missions, and it's so counterintuitive, right? Jesus, the King of everything, the Creator, who laid down his life and considered himself nothing. He humbled himself to death, even death, like the worst kind of death, not even just death on a cross, which was humiliating, right? And so we have this example, and yet we often don't take it seriously and listen to what the mandate is there to humble ourselves and listen and sacrifice, right, for the greater good of the community that we're serving. One thing that stuck out to me just by way of a model, Praxis Labs has a model that I've found very helpful in what we do and even in my own leadership. And what they show is three. If you just search, Praxis Labs Redemptive model, you'll find it on, any web page. But what they do is they've created three concentric circles. So one inside of another, right? The innermost circle is this idea of exploitative, right? The exploitative, so we can apply this to missions, exploitative missions, right? And so everything about the endeavor is selfish. We make ourselves great at any cost. We win at all costs. That's kind of like the saying of this inner circle. We want to win at any cost. And all of us can think about exploitative missions that have been done, especially short-term missions. The next circle in the concentric circles is ethical. And so we can say ethical missions. What is ethical missions, right? And this is simply trying not to do harm. It's doing well and doing good. It's abiding by all the practices. You go on the trip. You're not doing any harm. That's the standard, good practices. But the last concentric circle is redemptive, right? And that's the one we want to be in and talk about is redemptive missions. What does it look like to be involved in redemptive missions? And the idea here is creative restoration through sacrifice. So rather than just doing no harm as the standard, which is kind of the ethical standard, we're not just going to do no harm. We're going to up the ante on that and say the standard is creative restoration through Philippians 2, through sacrifice, through laying down our lives, through laying down what we want to see in this trip. Unfortunately, so much of the short-term mission community, I would say as being generous, that they fall into ethical. The ethical framework. I think a lot of people are just trying to do good. They don't know what they're doing. Any mistake they make is unintentional. It's usually not intentional. But is that good enough for us? Are we willing to settle for that? Or do we want to up the ante and say, you know what? God has called us to a higher calling and we need to be redemptive. We need to be involved in redemptive mission. So I've started to incorporate some of that terminology into what we're doing, and really found that helpful, and that it connects with students and adults to say, how am I engaging in a redemptive sort of mission? It helps reframe things. When I'm on the trip, I can say, how am I redeeming all things? Because Jesus was redeeming all things. And he says, I'm passing this mandate on to you, my other believers, my other disciples, right? You're now called to redeem all things. That is mind-blowing, that we're called to join Jesus in redeeming all things. So that becomes our question, I think, on mission, is how can I engage in more of a redemptive idea of mission?
No, that's great. I've used that in mentoring others and sharing with others the idea of like, let's leave a place, whether it's a workplace, whatever it is, better than it was when we got there. And I think that's the same concept of what we're talking about. I'm actually thinking in this moment, Alessandro in his church just hosted a huge event called Night to Shine. And one of the things they did was to fix the bathrooms of the place that was letting us use that spot. And they don't use that spot regular. It's once a year for this event, but the bathrooms are going to be fixed now forever for people that are using them. And so just a good example right there. But hey, this has gone a little bit long, but we've appreciated so much of what you've had to say. You've had some really good things for us to think about. And we do we do these mini series, and we try and have a balanced biblical approach, an interview with someone who's actually practicing these things, and then next episode is going to actually be on more tools. You've mentioned some. We can actually link to your guys' website where we can share the online academy and other things you have. But are there any other maybe short-term resources that you've used or heard of or would recommend that we might be able to link or talk about even in our next episode?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's so many. You know what's made the most impact, I think, even in our training, we use a lot of case studies. We found that to be wildly effective, where team members are reading things that other teams have done. And these are not made up. They're real life case studies that most long-term missionaries have submitted, right? To say this is a story of what happened and how it went horribly wrong, right? Usually they're the worst case scenarios, but it does give context to say, how do I ensure beyond a shadow of a doubt that never happens with what I'm doing? And so case studies are a phenomenal way to, understand and have empathy for the culture you're going into. An organization that I'm also affiliated with and a part of is, Standards of Excellence. You may have heard of them. They rebranded to Mission Works. And so they'd be a good resource to have some tools and some of these case studies. We have a bunch of these case studies on the Missions Academy as kind of part of the training. We have a bunch of free courses too that we offer, people, so that they don't have to make the full commitment on training. They can just kind of tease it out and see a shorter training. But yeah, unfortunately, there's not a lot of short-term mission resources out there. I would love to cheerlead and say these people are doing a really great job, which we always try and do in our organization, and always try and lift up other organizations and say, hey, check these guys out. There's not a lot of other training that's happening, out there. And so Culture, XP Culture is one, and Culture Link. Those are two different organizations, Culture Link and XP Culture. Those are two good organizations that offer very specific training on culture, generic culture, not culture specific. So I would also recommend them. Really great people that run those organizations, and would definitely cheerlead them also.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, Jesse, we really appreciated the things that you've shared with us, the food for thought that you've given us and the listeners. I think hope this as beneficial to those listening as it has been just to the three of us that have got to chat with you. Well, we want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and found it as insightful as we did. Your ministry is important, and so we hope that you consider your time with us listening to this podcast as an investment in your work. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends. And until next time, keep going wherever Jesus leads.